possible. The Clearinghouse always works citywide. So in that way, we were a logical venue to host a conversation like this. But as a white and privileged nonprofit organization with a white and privileged director, that's me, I question whether or not I should even have the microphone right now. And indeed, I will give it up very soon. But if tonight's conversation holds value to those who know the most and have everything at stake, and that's our colleagues and our neighbors of color, then in the future, my agency and I personally will help in this or other ways as a participant and colleague under or alongside other leadership. And by that, I was referring to this roadmap idea. We're here tonight to really launch a community conversation that would need to extend throughout the year and maybe longer. But the idea is that tonight we'll talk with some experts. We'll peel back some layers in this thorny issue of equity and racism in volunteerism. And we're going to come up with some action items, and we'll put them on something we're just calling a roadmap. So we're going to add action items to a roadmap at the end of the evening. And so keep in mind when you think of something that actually you could do or someone else should do, we'll put those down on a list at the end of the evening. So right now we're going to take a minute to take a picture of everybody who's here. You'll put on your best smile. I'm going to pass this over to Eugenia, and she'll explain what's going on. Eugenia, do you want me to explain it? Oh, you're there.
Sorry, no. I'm also live tweeting, so I had a little segment. Oh. So I see people are smiling now, so I'm just going to take advantage. There are 6 pictures, and I'm sorry to say this takes a second. I just got 1 out of 6, and I'm going to go as fast as I can, I promise. All right, if you came very early, you likely are done now. If you came very early, smiling again. So that is 1 more. All right. If you came medium, you're probably being pictured right now. I'm on page 3. I don't know how that translates to things.
I do.
I hear somebody maybe explaining this much better than me. Does anybody know how this works? Your wisdom is very appreciated if so. All right, I'm on the 4th out of 6. Thank you so much, everybody. All right, and I have bad news now. I just wanted to please everybody, and so I lost the first one. It didn't go through. So hold on one sec, because the last page is not live, people. It's just if you're sort of on pause. So I'm going back to the first page. That means people who came very early. Smile right now if you came early, because you are on candid camera. I am done. Thank you so, so much.
Eugenia, thank you very much. That's one of those things I would just really flub right now. So thank you. Thank you. So we can get right into the program now. I'm going to introduce our moderator. I'm delighted to introduce Maritza Grooms to all of you. I met Maritza when we are on the same committee in the coalition, the membership committee. She now leads that committee.
Bye, baby.
She's assistant, so Maritza Grooms is assistant director of Cambridge Community Television. She also co-hosts a monthly program called History in Lowell, which I actually looked at a few episodes. It's really great. I recommend people to look it up, History in Lowell, uncovering and connecting local history to current social issues. Maritza is passionate about community, amplifying marginalized voices, and speaking out about inequities, especially those facing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Maritza, take it away.
Thanks, Lori, and thank you all for being here today. As we are about to go into this space, I just want to start by defining some terms, because when language is clear, we have better tools to identify, dismantle, and disrupt racism where we see it. And Obviously, our presenters are going to be sharing their experience and insights around equity, privilege, racism, and other isms historically structured into the volunteer space. So I'm going to start with DEI, because that's a phrase that we hear all the time. I think it's like a buzzword right now. And oftentimes we hear diversity, equity, and inclusion used interchangeably, but it's very important that we make a distinction about those terms. So diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting, specifically difference of identities. And today we will be talking about race specifically, but of course we also include other identities such as gender, ability, sexual orientation, and more. Equity is giving everyone proportional access to opportunities and resources that address disparities created and perpetuated by systemic racism. It can also be thought of as constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power. One thing I would like to make note of is that understanding intersectionality, which looks at how oppressions based on identity interact with and affect each other, is key to equitable outcomes. Inclusion can be defined as the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded. And of course, we're talking about our privilege in the space, so we definitely want to acknowledge that. Privilege is unearned advantage granted to individuals of a dominant social group. And then lastly, anti-racism and other isms. And I want to thank one of our panelists, Jerome, for making sure that we do not conflate anti-racism with DEI. It is a process of actively identifying and opposing racism. The goal of anti-racism is to challenge racism and actively change the policies, behaviors, and beliefs that perpetuate racist ideas and actions. Anti-racism is rooted in action, and it's about taking steps to eliminate racism at the individual, institutional, and structural levels. And we are all about action today. We will be talking about action items for our roadmap, and if you have ideas for that, put it in the chat. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists. Bernette Dawson is well known to those of us involved in Cambridge Public Schools, where she is an activist for equality and justice. A co-founder of the Cambridge Families of Color Coalition, Bernette also served on the CPSD Building Equity Bridges initiative and is a leader within North Cambridge Courageous Conversations. She's a graduate of Brandeis University and Babson College's Women Entrepreneurs Program, and she's a registered nurse. Welcome, Bernette. Thank you. We also have Sue Carter-Kahl, who is an evaluator, writer, and facilitator. She is a nationally recognized expert in volunteer engagement and teaches strategic volunteer engagement at the University of San Diego. Sue has a PhD in leadership and a master's in social work administration. She blogs at volunteercommons.org and is committed to bridging theory and practice. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Maritza.
Absolutely. And last but definitely not least, Jerome Tennille. Jerome designs social good programs. He is manager of social impact and volunteerism for Marriott International, speaking today as an independent advisor regarding organizational sustainability and social impact. Jerome holds a Master of Sustainability Leadership from Arizona State University and is one of less than 2,000 professionals who holds a certification in volunteer administration. He's also a Navy veteran, and so that brings a whole different element of service. Thank you so much, Jerome.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. So I want to remind the audience to put your questions in the chat, and we're gonna get started. And also, if you have any ideas about action items as they come up, throw those in the chat as well. This is definitely meant to be an action-oriented event. So for my panelists here, I've heard people say volunteering requires a certain amount of privilege to participate in. What does that mean? And we can start with you, Bernette.
It most definitely means that when it comes to not all people of color, but like there's a sacrifice somewhere. So it's not only with work, it could be just spending time with family. It's just gets overwhelmed in that aspect. So when I say volunteer is a privilege, is that we just don't have an ample amount of time just to do whatever we want and just volunteer any which way. We have to really dedicate our time or actually be strategic on where we're going to volunteer our time.
Yes, certainly, certainly. Jerome, would you like to take that next?
Yeah, of course. So when I think about privilege, we have to acknowledge that the ability to volunteer requires a certain amount of economic, social, and human capital. And so those in our community who have less of all of those, or who live in poverty or have greater social exclusion, they simply don't have the same access as I do or other people do in volunteering with some of the same organizations that might be even advocating on their behalf.
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to come back to you for how privilege plays out for people of color in a corporate environment. But before that, Sue, would you like to take a stab at that first question?
Thanks. For me, I really think about privilege in terms of having a choice. So a choice about how I want to spend my time, a choice to be comfortable or to opt into something that's convenient for me. And so I think about even the kinds of things I've done volunteering. I had jobs that would let me take time off to go volunteer or to get trained as a volunteer. And it didn't mean that I had to completely rearrange my life to do that, just as one example. So it's really having not only the time, but really the supports around me to enable me to participate in a particular way.
Absolutely. Thank you all for kicking us off with awesome answers. So go ahead, Jerome. Let's talk about how that privilege plays out for people of color in a corporate environment.
Yeah, so, in my position working in the travel and hospitality industry, I see this play out every single day. A lot of our associates where I work, and just in our industry, right? Travel, hospitality, lodging, the service industry are people of color. Unfortunately, a lot of the positions that are filled by people of color don't have a living wage. So people are working multiple jobs. They're hourly associates or employees with wherever they're working. And what I see is that there's a divide between who is afforded the same level of access to volunteering in the communities where we do business as an industry, because those positions that have less access are filled by people of color. And so, there is certainly an implication on not being able to uplift people of color into ladders of leadership to also afford them that same privilege that I have or that other people have. And so I certainly see this play out in the corporate environment for sure. Managers and above are oftentimes not people of color, but those are the positions that are often salaried, that have, an internet access for their full duration. These people work in an office. They're not customer facing, but people of color are oftentimes, they find themselves in positions that have greater limitations to what they can do during working hours.
Yes, yes. So many limitations, and definitely that issue of access, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Bernette or Sue, would either of you like to tackle this from a different perspective?
So you can go ahead.
I don't feel like I have as much experience in this space, other than to just perhaps mention the, again, the access piece of it. And so thinking about all the different ways of access. So sometimes that's transportation, sometimes that's the time off, sometimes that's when we're thinking beyond able-bodied volunteers, what are the other ways that people need to kind of tap into that, and where are the resources for that?
Where are the resources indeed? Bernette, is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Jerome and Sue had made great points, but even if people of color are in the higher positions where they're salaried, it is sometimes, as I had said earlier, it is a sacrifice. So they may still do the volunteer, but something is being sacrificed around it. And so that does cause stress and anxiety around just even volunteering sometimes, because big corporations, they have like a day of doing volunteerism. So you have to take a day out of your personal time to do it. So there is some type of sacrifice there. So it's really about having that understanding too.
Also, I would like to remind everyone, if you are not speaking, please mute yourselves so that way we can make sure to hear our incredible panelists and all of everything that they have to say. Thank you so much, Bernette. Yes, we're talking about sacrifice, we're talking about access, we're talking about privilege or lack thereof, right, in these spaces. Now we're going to get a little bit more specific here. So what does it mean to create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive mechanism that engages volunteers, and why is that important? So we'll start with Bernette again and work our way around.
It is super important. It's not even necessarily a mechanism to start with. Like, you have to start inward. What does your organization look like? Is it viewing itself in an anti-racist, anti-bias lens? And that's where you really need to start. You have to start there at the ground with that way of thinking before you can actually move forward, is what I think, to start off with. I'll let people kind of chime in and then I'll add more.
Jerome, you look like you're ready to answer this question.
Well, I mean, I have, my own personal views on this just from what I've seen and what I have personal experience. But, when we think about creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive mechanism that engages people in service, for me, it means, simply removing some of those barriers that I talked about before. These are the economic, social, and human barriers that exist to eventually allow these diverse communities to engage in the act of giving their time and service without a paycheck, right? So there are a lot of these barriers, but I think when I think about how it's important, this is what I personally believe, right? That, volunteering, to me, it is one of our abilities to conduct civic duty or civic action, right? So to me, it's one of the strongest acts of exercising our democracy as people. We're able to, very similarly, like when we cast a ballot to vote, we can put our time towards causes and focus areas that mean something to us. And so right now, exercising our democracy is incredibly important. But the unfortunate part is that it's not accessible by many. And I believe that if we believe as a society that voting should be a right and is accessible to all, then we also have to really think about how other ways that people get civically engaged, how that becomes accessible to the many, right? So that's why, to me, it's incredibly important.
Absolutely. I never thought about volunteering as a civic engagement piece, and thank you for that. I don't know if other folks had reactions to that. Please definitely let us know in the chat. Sue, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. It's a big question, and it seems like we could spend the whole talking about this one. But for me, as I think about this, we talk a lot about who's at the table. But I think there's a broader conversation that really is about power and decision making. So who gets invited to the table, who's running the meeting, who decides who's invited, who decides on the agenda, how do we even decide what decisions are going to be made. And I think when we start to look at that at our nonprofits, then especially at the volunteer level, is thinking about, well, where do we allow the community in as volunteers? So who do we say is qualified, and who is celebrated in our organization? Is it the communities we're serving? Is it other people from outside of our community? I think we need to look at, who is a gatekeeper basically into the work. Most of us started as all volunteer organizations. And so as we get bigger and as we get staffed up, sometimes we start questioning, oh, well, can a volunteer do this? And of course they can. They did everything in the beginning. So I think there's really a bigger question about power. And I think it's critical for our community organizations to bring DEI into volunteerism, because if we're not aware of this, we can just end up perpetuating racial injustice. We end up kind of circling back to just reinforcing power and privilege that exist rather than working against that.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks, oh, go ahead. That's exactly, I was going to say, it speaks to your point, Bernette, go ahead.
And actually also too, the way we think about it, skilled versus skilled-based volunteers, that is a problem within that statement. Because that is really rooted in racism and white supremacy. Like, all volunteers have skills, and it is really the organization's responsibility to expand that definition and what is traditionally thought of what is skilled and unskilled. So everyone that's coming to the table has some type of skill, and it is really the organization's responsibility to figure out where they would fit in with that.
Absolutely.
Hey,
Go
might I
ahead,
just
Jerome.
add something onto that? I'm sorry. I know that we're probably going to talk about skills-based here in a little bit, but one of the exercises that I found that I had to do within our company when we're talking about engaging people across the company to serve their communities where we do business, I've had to actually teach people that they actually have skills that nonprofits need. I remember going up to a property in Baltimore when I first joined the company, and we were on this quest to create a skills-based toolkit. And I was talking to the manager of housekeeping, and he said, Jerome, I manage the pack, but I don't lead the pack. But when I was actually connecting with the housekeepers, they were actually surprised when I told them that they had skills that nonprofits could use, right? They said, Jerome, I'm just a housekeeper. What could I possibly have to give to a nonprofit? But when you think about it through the community lens, I think there are a lot of homeless shelters or transitional housing shelters that could use the skills of a housekeeper. And I think we have to reteach people that they actually have skills, regardless of where they sit within a company or regardless of where they sit as people. We all have transferable skills that nonprofits need. And I think, unfortunately, we don't do a good enough job at teaching people that they have that value, that everybody can get something from.
For sure. Someone in the chat said that they had been struggling with the term skills-based for quite a while, and you all are thanked for bringing that up. I think that also, as we're talking about the power of the people and the people at the table who get to choose, right? That's a thing that comes up, skills-based. But before we get back to skills-based, I would like to also address, how do we identify the barriers? How do we identify those gatekeepers, right? Even who are at the table.
My thing is, are our organizations willing to really share the power? Because it's the difference of having a seat at the table, but if you can be sitting there but not have a voice. Are we willing to share that voice and listen and share that power? So that's what I think is another question that would help lower some of those barriers and be more welcoming.
Right. And I think there's a piece where there's value in having processes so that we are ensuring that everyone volunteering with us is safe. But I think there's another piece about looking at our relationship with risk and control. And again, volunteers have a lot of ability and capacity. And so when we get too concerned or think about, well, if this doesn't go right, then it's going to be on me. We'll think about, how are we sharing responsibility? How are we engaging people as partners in the work rather than sort of somebody we keep at arm's length? But I think those are the kinds of things, and we might need to give up, we often need to give up some sort of control so that we can let people in as partners and have more authentic relationships rather than seeing it as a transactional kind of exchange.
Jerome, do you have anything to say to that?
I think depending on the community and depending on the organization, when we think about identifying and addressing barriers, I think these barriers are different based on community ideals, right? That might be rooted in cultural, social, or even religious values. But they also might be like economic. I'm never like the person to say, well, let's throw money at the problem. But I think when we think about some of the economic barriers, I think there are a lot of things that can be done to remove barriers with how, and this could be a whole different panel discussion about the funding process, the broken funding process that exists between strategic philanthropy and organizations that engage volunteers, right? There is a broken process there. And that's a part, that's like one of like many issues when we're talking about reducing barriers to create more inclusive mechanisms that engage volunteers.
There's actually a question in the chat that has to do with that. Is financially compensating stipends and et cetera volunteers a way to be more equitable as an organization for volunteers? In all of your opinion, does this change the nature of volunteering?
I think the short answer is yes, it does help. And I don't think it actually changes the nature of volunteering, right? We're making it more accessible. And I've seen this done with certain organizations, and it's done very effectively. And what we're not saying is we're going to compensate you. We're not going to pay you, right, as somebody who's, volunteer. Like, we're not going to pay you like a full staffing. You're not paid staff. But what we're doing is we're acknowledging and recognizing the fact that volunteers bear a cost, regardless of who they're supporting. There is a cost that is involved, time and economic, right? And those things matter. And those could be the smallest thing that prevents somebody, whether it's paying for childcare or whether it's paying for, bus fare or a train or an Uber ride or gas or overnight lodging in some cases, right? These are big barriers, right? These are things that I think about. I don't think it changes the nature. It just makes it accessible to those who wouldn't otherwise have the ability to do it.
Sue or Bernette, would you like to follow up?
Bernette, it looked like you had a comment. I'll defer to you.
No, Jerome kind of hit it right on its head. But also too, when we do volunteer intake, just asset mapping, because then that is another way of just helping with that process. But it is really just saying, I know this is just a token. This is not equivalent to the value you bring to the table, but this is just a token of appreciation. So I think that's where you're not paying folks to volunteer. It is just really showing a token of appreciation. And that could be in a dollar amount, or as Jerome said, like childcare, bus fare, or whatever, but it's really just saying we value you. And sometimes it's really the little things that folks need of showing that appreciation that motivates folks to volunteer.
Yes. Someone did ask Jerome, what about part-time positions instead of volunteers shouldering the cost? But I think that you addressed that earlier in your answer. And then for you, Bernette, someone asked, what do you mean by asset mapping?
I think earlier as we were talking, it is really figuring out their skills, not their skills or non-skills. It's just really having that conversation and just seeing where they would fit in the organization. And I think, Jerome, you utilize the story of the housekeepers, and that is just a conversation. And like the intake map, asset mapping does not have to be so traditional of like checking off boxes, but it's really just having a conversation. And as you're having that conversation, analyzing where would they be utilized the best.
Absolutely. Sue or Jerome, do you have anything else that you'd like to add? No, awesome.
I think go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sue.
I think there's a piece here that volunteering is reflecting kind of bigger societal pieces, right? So when I was first out of college, I taught aerobics and I worked with adults to help them live independently. They had developmental disabilities. I got paid more per hour to teach aerobics than I did to support women living on their own in their home. And so I think there's a whole conversation right now as we talk about minimum wage even that gets at it. But what are the ways that we can elevate all of the different ways that volunteers can contribute to our organizations. And I think sometimes the conversations about, putting a dollar amount on volunteer time can actually get in the way. So yes, we want to value what volunteers have to us, but a lot of times what volunteers are bringing go far beyond any monetary or financial kind of contribution, because they're bringing a depth of relationship and commitment and passion and willingness to work and be part of the community. So I'll just add that piece to it.
Absolutely. Someone included, there's the question of feeling welcome in a new situation also, right? And as we're talking about access and even just engaging volunteers, those folks who have to meet the barriers, how do you promote the value of volunteering to diverse candidates? How do you promote that for folks who find it to be a privilege? And anybody can start. Go ahead, Bernette, I see you.
It is really, I think, what is your organization? What are they doing around the anti-racism, anti-ism, having that lens? Is that outwardly known? Is that on your website, your mission statement? And that is kind of just a starting point, because that will attract more BIPOC folks of wanting to work with you because you are outwardly saying that. So just even having that standard of what does your anti-racism or anti-ism lens look like, and starting there. And I'll pause and let my fellow panelists.
For me, I sometimes wonder, I don't know that we have to promote the value of volunteering per se. I think people already are committed to their communities and to service in a lot of different ways. I think maybe the question is, why would they come volunteer with us? They're already doing a lot of things, taking care of families and getting and taking care of community. So what is it about our experience that's going to be a unique value add for them? In what way are we making the experience welcoming, hospitable, that it feels like a good place to be, that you can be seen and heard there? And so that doesn't seem to me as much about, oh, how can I get you to volunteer? That seems like a real means to an end, but how can this be a place where you feel like you can engage with other people who care about the same things with you, and have a way to take action on those things you care about?
Go for it, Jerome.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this from a very different perspective, perhaps. I think we have to understand that not everybody values giving their time for no paycheck, right? And what I'm talking about is the idea that when I'm talking about value, I don't mean like the dollar value of volunteering, but I mean like the moral value of volunteering as a society, right? In the work that I do in the hospitality industry, I have the privilege, if you will, of being challenged every single day with getting people across 144 countries and territories to serve their communities, while also acknowledging and understanding that volunteering as a word doesn't exist in every language, and it's not universally, socially, or religiously valued. There are some communities within Africa and the Middle East who believe that it's not a man's place to give their time for free, right? The man is the provider, so he needs to get a paycheck. So it's only the woman's place to volunteer, right? So these things are drawn by like gender lines in some places. And so when I think about like, how do we promote the value of volunteering? I think we have to first acknowledge that some of the diverse communities, right? I'm talking about cultures that exist not just elsewhere, but here. As we become more multicultural as a nation, we also have to understand that people bring those cultures and values here. And I don't expect they're going to change their values. And we have to acknowledge that they might not have the same value on volunteering. And so when we approach this diverse community and say, well, we should do this because it's morally right and it's good and all that stuff that we understand as America, as a westernized nation, we have to understand that not everybody's going to value it the same way. And so we have to understand that, acknowledge it, and then figure out like, if we are going to engage with a diverse community, like how do they even think about it, right? Like first and foremost.
Absolutely.
Because what we don't want to do is push our culture onto somebody else unintentionally because we believe that they should value it the same way I do, right? That's a problem. And I think we do that too often in our communities.
How do you approach that? How do you approach it from a standpoint of recruiting volunteers when you don't want to push those values?
I think it's really first understanding any cultural sensitivities, right? So I think HR, talent acquisition teams have been doing this work for a long time, but I think it's also valuable that people who engage volunteers also like get smart on the cultures that they're going to be connecting with or potentially connecting with, right? And really understand what these pain points are. When I was in the military, every time that we would deploy to another nation, we would have cultural sensitivity training, like up to wazoo. So we understood the environment that we were going into culturally, and that way we could assimilate and fit into that. And I think as managers who engage volunteers, we have to understand that if we want more diverse communities to be engaged within our networks, then we have to understand what those sensitivities are.
Absolutely. And just one more follow-up to what you're talking about, Jerome. Someone from the chat asked, and this may be a hard question to ask, what is a good question? And there may be many questions to tease out how someone values volunteering.
That's a great point. I don't know that there's any single question. I'm sure there's a laundry list of things that we could prescribe. What I would say is that you don't have to do it alone, right? There are organizations, consulting companies, and Fortune companies, Fortune 500 companies, who have done all this research, and maybe you could perhaps piggyback off of an education institute or for-profit company who's already done all this stuff, who can provide it to you in gratis or pro bono, so that you don't have to do all this. Like, you don't have to recreate the wheel. You don't have to do this alone. Find a subject matter expert who can partner with you to help you through that process, because it's not a single question, right? So that's like the answer that I would give in that one.
And
Thank
then
you.
I would like to add, understand that not every organization is going to align right with the person you're trying to recruit.
Yeah.
So you can try all of these different angles, but if your values don't align right, or they just don't feel connected, then that is something that you just have to accept too. So that sometimes, like, you can do all of the things to check the boxes, but sometimes it's not a good fit. Just like with a regular job, it could be that you were great on paper, but you just it was not aligning. So that's one thing I would like to add with that.
And I think sometimes we assume that people should want to come to us and should try to find us, to go through our processes, to do all the work to come to us. And I think, and I get that everyone's overwhelmed, but I think there's a lot that is about this expectation, and I say us, meaning collective white we, that we expect people to get through the burdens to get to us and to go jump through our hoops. When we really, I think, have an obligation, especially if we're starting to say, well, how would we engage a community that we haven't engaged with traditionally? How might we go to them? How might we find out about their organizations, their community groups, their neighborhood convenings? In what ways do we need to educate ourselves? And so the burden has really been on people of color primarily, and we don't even notice that a lot of times as white people. And so how do we take some of that burden on ourselves? Let's us do the homework. Let's us find these organizations. And maybe they don't have a website. Maybe it's about relationships. Because I think when we can engage in that way and show up in those organizations, be a follower in some of these organizations, we build relationships, we build trust, and that's the way we might work together. That's doing with rather than to. And so I think that we have to look at those ways that we can do the outreach, not expecting to just create these new funnels for people to drop into our laps. But the work is on us to go find who else already cares about these things and may already be doing this work. We kind of assume we've got all the answers a lot of times.
So that speaks to a question that was right in the chat, almost exactly. Why does the process have to be waiting for, in parentheses, privileged people to volunteer, then finding the right fit? Recruitment often happens in places of privilege, corporations, universities, etc. How to start in the community? So would you like to follow up on that? And that sounds like an action item, right? Where do we start?
Mhm.
Would anybody
So
like
I think part of that, and I'll apologize because I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, and it's really tricky to listen and read at the same time because there's a lot of really juicy questions over there. So I'm just gonna name that. And thank you for pulling those in for us, Maritza. So I think part of that is, you know, do the research. And so that might be finding out who's already doing this work, and then where do we tap into that? How can we be part of that work rather than expecting people to join into our work or think, and I think there's also a piece that even talking about being inclusive or hospitable, or I read a book that was great. She talks about radical welcome. Is we sometimes think we just have to be nice, but I think it's really about, it's again, getting back to the power. So what are the kinds of, and so engaging with other community partners where they have power and where they're making decisions, where they've defined who's at the table and what's being done, when we can show up to those kinds of partnerships, or to look at broaching those kinds of partnerships, that's when we start to have a whole different way of being around this work.
Jerome or Bernette, would you like to tackle that one? How to start in the community?
Well, I was just going to say, I think she, you know, I think Sue really hit the nail on the head. I don't know that I have anything to add. I think it really depends on the community that you're trying to do outreach in, right? Like those are very unique things. So that would probably require a little bit more thought to address all those unique, you know, nuances, but.
No, I definitely agree. It is like each community is unique, but it is actually putting down your ways of processing or engaging, and actually maybe just sitting and listening. Go to those organizations, like maybe events, and just observe, or buy a table at one of their galas and participate in that way before you actually start that whole building a relationship. Just start to just listen and engage in that way. And that is just a start of ways of doing. And then I think Sue kind of really mapped it out.
Well, here's a really great question from the chat that kind of speaks to some of this. Hi, I'm the volunteer recruiter at the Ryan Immigration Center, and we assist immigrants from all over the world. We struggle to attract BIPOC volunteers. I would love to hear about what we might be doing wrong or what other organizations are doing. Until recently, March of last year, we were called the Irish International Immigrant Center, and I think the word Irish was a put off for BIPOCs. I would love to hear from the panel or other people here, and would love to have volunteers that reflect our client base. So yes, go ahead, Jerome.
I was going to say, well, I think words matter, right? So I think when people are looking at organizations, they make an immediate judgment on who's accepted and who's not, right? Just like we eat with our eyes first, I think volunteers, they look at an organization, they see what the makeup of the organization is, they look at the photos, they look at the name, the nomenclature that's used, and they place an immediate judgment, right? So I think that might be a part of it. Like I don't know enough about this organization to understand if the nomenclature that they're using, the name of the organization is off-putting to people of color, but I would say that's probably one aspect. People are using their lens to make a judgment, like they would look at a book and judge a book on its cover, right? Separately from that, I think understanding more of the intimate details of how they're trying to connect with brown and Black communities of color would also, I think, inform some of that, the idea of where barriers might exist, but without understanding some of those details, I wouldn't want to speculate on the reasons why, but I would just say that from a, we all judge things, but from a very optical judgment, I think some people just might honestly just be put off by the name of the organization. And I think we see this too with religious-based organizations, right? I think we see this, right? Like the Salvation Army, or regardless of what it is, there was an organization here in the DC area that changed their name because it was so religious in nomenclature that people were not volunteering because they assumed that the organization was anti-LGBTQ, right? So I think names and verbiage does matter partly.
Absolutely. Bernette or Sue, would you like to tackle that?
No, I think Jerome was right. Names do matter, and without assuming anything else, like for even the organization that I co-founded, the Cambridge Families Color Coalition. Folks are going to automatically assume, well, I don't live in Cambridge, so I shouldn't, or I'm not a person of color, so I shouldn't. Or we do have white folks that do want to volunteer, but like they have to be in a whole totally different category of the way they volunteer with our organization. So it does really play in the name in how people interpret it.
And I think the language piece is such an important one. So it's not just in the naming, but really, how are we talking about this community? So are we lifting up its strengths and all of the dynamic richness that are part of the community? Or are we just focusing on problems or challenges? As nonprofits, we have sort of perpetuated some poverty porn by using language or images that will sort of induce pity and kind of, oh, you should come help out of guilt, or you should come help because you want to come save or fix these folks, and that's a problem. So it's the language that we're using on our websites, the language we use on the volunteer. Like, are we saying, oh, come be a superhero because you can come out and volunteer for 2 hours? Are we saying, no, come be part of a movement that is trying to change something for the better? Come be a partner in this work. We don't expect that you can change the world in 2 hours, but if you're willing to make a commitment, then we'd love to find a way to partner together. It's great if you just want to try out things too, but let's not oversell the expectations and the language we're using around volunteering too. So I think there's a lot with the language we use around volunteerism that kind of gets in the way of helping us move forward. So I think there's also in how we're talking about our community that we're serving, because too often we focus on the needs of the funders and we end up othering the very people we're supposed to be serving. So there's a podcast with Brittany Coe, who works at an organization in, I think, Metro Services in Texas. And they call all of the people they serve neighbors. And that's a whole different way of engaging with someone than if they're a client or a consumer even. And so how do I show up in community with other neighbors? I have something to give, I have something to receive as a volunteer or as one of the people using the services. And so I think there's lots of ways we can play with language to help make things more equitable.
And then I just want to add too that even though it is a nonprofit, it's still a brand. So branding is everything. So I think Sue was really talking about that, but just really muddling it down, like branding is everything. So if your branding or what is really being perceived by folks is not great, then that is going to be problematic for you. So maybe rebrand if you're having those issues.
Well, I think all three of you have spoken to the various ways that we can make organizations and spaces more inclusive, right? Because it has to do with language, it has to do with branding, it has to do with meeting people where they're at and identifying their values, right? That may not be our values, and how do we make these spaces more equitable and inclusive? And someone did reply, Sue, to what you were talking about. Someone said it scares them a little that they know there are national organizations that promote exactly what you're talking about, and it bothers them. Someone else also mentioned tapping clients in some of these spaces as volunteers. What do you all think about that? Sue, go ahead.
I think there can be value to that, because it doesn't say here are the people who can help and here are the people who need help. So there was a community center that I studied as part of my research in New York, and the executive director said, we want everyone to feel like they're part of this community, and so we want people who use the gym to also volunteer, and the seniors who go to our lunch to also know they can help out in our preschool. And so they were blurring the lines between their labels, because I think a lot of times we use labels in our organizations to kind of, we treat donors one way, volunteers another way, and participants a different way. And a lot of times people just love our organization and they just think of themselves as a fan of the organization. And so kind of saying, well, I'm wearing my volunteer hat now and my donor hat here, or my participant hat. We treat all those people differently. And folks notice that. So that's a little bit of a different issue. So I don't want to get off track on that, but I think that it can be really powerful to ask people, like, how would you like to design this volunteerism? And what puts the community at the center? So it's not about what the funders want or what our reporting mandates require us.
What I would add to that, I agree with everything that Sue said. I think it's all very powerful. And we also have to we have to understand that that's also a double-edged sword. I had a client who, the community that they were serving was very homogenous. And a lot of those individuals we also sought as volunteers, but it became so much that community was volunteering. And I should share that this was a white, Caucasian, European descent, homogenous. The families that we were serving were volunteering, but it became so much so that other communities didn't feel like they could volunteer unless they had went through the same circumstances as the families that we were serving who were also volunteering, right? Which just perpetuated this homogenous environment and still does in many ways to this day. So we also have to understand that that's like a double-edged sword when you tap into the same community. That being said, I mean, again, I agree with everything that Sue's saying. I think when we're talking about connecting with Black and Brown, Indigenous people of color, that can be a very powerful tool. When we're tapping the same group and it happens to be a homogenous group that we're trying to make more diverse, and it can sort of have the opposite effect in some ways.
Yes. Bernette, do you have anything to add?
I think what Sue and Jerome has said is really great. And I think just once again, what is the culture? Just even the culture in the organization. Are you valuing one over the other? And does it feel like a family? Does it feel like you're really having everyone feel like they belong? Is that sense of belonging? So I think just really coming from that place of really making sure that it's almost like a family and everybody feels belonged and welcome, then that could be very helpful too.
Absolutely. Someone agreed that the work here is full of double-edged swords. And back to the idea of branding and inclusion, right? Someone also mentioned you have to ensure that it's authentic, and you can't tokenize or else it will backfire. So question to follow that up, how do white folks avoid tokenism and achieve intentional engagement with BIPOC volunteer candidates?
I'll use myself as an example, right? This comes up often in the work that I do. So I'll share an example. And again, this is just my single perspective. I'm not saying this is going to work for everybody, but it's just it's something that I always appreciate as a man of color. So I was working with a client, and you know, a lot of the work that I do is in, you know, of late has been DEI and anti-racism as it relates to mechanisms that engage volunteers. And what I found so thoughtful and I really appreciated is this client, they asked me, they said, Jerome, do you identify as a person of color? And I said, yes, I do. And they said, okay, I appreciate your sharing that because that's something we want to be really sensitive about. And they wanted to acknowledge that that they don't want to seek my services to be a token man of color who's giving DEI presentations for their homogenous pool of association members, right? And they just simply acknowledged that, and they also shared that they wanted to be sensitive. But in addition to that, they shared that they were seeking my services because of my expertise in the service. So they acknowledged my skill set and my expertise and my experience and background. And then they went the next step further, and they also said, you know, if you would rather do a different subject for our speaker series, we're certainly okay with that, but we would like you to make that choice on your own, right? So it acknowledged my inherent diversity that I can't change. It acknowledged the sensitivity to the idea of being the token person of color, giving a DEI. They also shared that they want to be sensitive to that. They acknowledged my skill set, my expertise as a person, and they went the next step and they said, if you would rather do a different subject, we're all for that because we know that you can do a myriad of things, right? So for me, it checked all the blocks of them acknowledging that, being sensitive to it, and then letting me make the final choice on what I deliver to their people, right? I found that very. I mean, I can't express how that made me feel as a person, but it was great. And maybe there's a bit of that other people on this call can say, oh, okay, I get where he's coming from. Maybe that answers some questions, maybe it leaves more questions, but that's just from my own personal perspective on what worked for me and what I really appreciated.
Thank you, Jerome. And I think that speaks to Bernette's point earlier about how organizations are approaching this work. If you're, coming from how anti-racist is your organization, I think was what you said earlier. And would you like to add?
Yes, no, I think Jerome's example is amazing because transparency is key. And actually, transparency is kindness. So just having that level of transparency allows the vulnerability to come in that trust to start to build. And then also too, not just that that person of color being your go-to person to ask, like almost like that ask your Black friend questions. Like if you can Google it. Do not ask your person that is on your team or your organization around some of this work. So that's what I will contribute. But I think Jerome's example was great. And as I will say again, transparency is really key with that and really seeing the value in the person and not just seeing their race.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Diversity is something that you have, right? But inclusion is something that you do, and acknowledging someone's expertise, I think is crucial to any space, right? And yeah, I love that transparency is key, but transparency is kindness. I really love that. Sue, do you have anything to add?
I'll add just if we're showing up as partners with someone else in our community, that again, we're doing with rather than to someone. And so what does that mean? And what is my role? My role as a white person may be to step back. It may be to help make a connection. But I think it's to listen and be humble and be accountable. And when I step in it, to apologize. So I think there are those pieces too, to move forward. And with the transparency, sometimes issues are going to come up that might be difficult. Stay with it, stay engaged, keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Just a few comments from the chat. As a business, we often call upon our employees of color to volunteer for activities where we are working with students. Our intention is to ensure that students have a career role model that allows them to picture themselves in the future. However, I'm struggling with how to balance the extra burden that we're placing on these employees. I appreciate Jerome's story of how an organization made him feel valued. And someone else says, thank you. This is also an issue in community-based participatory research. We have to try to be part of the community. We can't swoop in to do things to the community. Yes. And let's see, here's another. I have had the experience of finding DEI expert organizations via Google search, then later finding out that they are considered a joke by BIPOC communities. Do you have any suggestions for vetting orgs? That one. Yes, who would like to tackle that one?
Oh gosh. I'm going to address a different question, or maybe a couple of these. I'm not really sure. That one's got me laughing a little bit. I'm going to go to Amanda's question about business, because I think this is something I can relate to, and I've worked within our company, Merit International, to in various degrees. So I believe it's very important that people see somebody like them in a position of leadership, right, as that career mentor. We had a very recent engagement with one of our organizations here in the DC area that is a part of the American Food Bank Network, and we had one of our C-suite executives, who is a Black female, do the keynote presentation on behalf of our company for this organization. And a majority of the communities that we're supporting through this culinary workforce program are people of color. And we felt it was incredibly important that they see somebody who's ascended to that position that they can identify and recognize and say, I want to be just like her one day. The other part of that too is, again, full of double-edged sword, like Brittany says. But I think when we're thinking about engaging volunteers who are people of color, and we have to acknowledge that burden. So you acknowledged it within your question, but I think we also have to be proactive in acknowledging that burden, and also surveying these employee volunteers on how do they feel, right? I think we don't ask enough feeling questions in volunteer engagement. And I know that we don't ask enough feeling questions with employee volunteer engagement to just understand how they're digesting this, how do they feel about their participation, and get their reaction. They might have suggestions or have feedback that might reinforce your thought, or maybe they're going to be like, you know what, I feel that this is incredibly important, and I am over the moon excited that you even asked me, right? We don't know that unless we ask them. So so to that specific question, Amanda's question, I would say engage these folks in a town hall session, ask them a question via survey or something. I work with a lot of employee volunteer teams and their team leaders, and I ask them a lot of questions because I want to know how they're feeling about the work that they're helping us champion as a company. The other question about DEI experts and being considered a joke by people of color, I'm not gonna, I don't know that I have enough information to address that one, but.
I have a comment on actually that one. When you're looking for folks, it should not be a thing to do. It should be more about how you invested in yourself. And I kind of take it on like a fad diet. When the new year starts, we're like, all right, we're going to do this cleanse and I'm going to drop this pounds. But then because it's a fad diet, we jump off the wagon. But yet when we really make the lifestyle change to eat cleaner, to do better, we embody it. And so when you are thinking about doing this work and you vet people out, who is going to help you embody this work? Because it's not just when you're in your organization. It is when you are going to the grocery store. It's when you are picking up your kids or just having a conversation. Like, being really an anti-racist or really having that lens or anti-bias lens, it is really embodying a new way of living and checking yourself constantly. So when you are looking for someone to help you with that, these are some of the things you should keep in mind. Yeah, authenticity is definitely key.
Sue, would you like to address any of those questions?
I don't think I can add anything to what Bernette said already. I know that I think there's sort of this truism in volunteerism that volunteers should reflect the communities they're serving, kind of to that point. And we haven't necessarily always challenged that, but I think that there are, just like Jerome said earlier, right? There's no absolute, there's not just one way, right way. And so it's getting to know what does this particular group need, and one program might be different within the organization than another. So what is it that the participants want? Who would they like to see volunteering? You know, I was involved with Girl Scouts for a long time, and so they had a push to get younger women who were volunteering, because that's who the teen Girl Scouts really looked up to, for example. And so, like Jerome said, ask the questions. Sometimes have surveys, but sometimes just have informal conversations while you're volunteering with them, or when volunteers are coming or going. Those are great times to get to find out about what they value, why they're there, and what the experience has meant for them. And I think the other piece is building those into the experiences so that there are chances for reflection and discussion, that we don't just shortchange that, because that can be the real substance sometimes of what's happening. And sometimes those need to happen with the group, all of the participants, the volunteers, and the neighbors, for example, or sometimes that needs to happen aside, especially if we think there might be comments that could do harm to communities of color, for example, as white people are kind of working our stuff out.
Absolutely. Yes, we definitely still have time, but I want to be mindful of that time because we are quickly running out, unfortunately, and there's so much richness to get to. But I do want to address one of these questions in the chat. Are there current books or resources specific to these kinds of conversations for further education? This person's looking for something higher level, not necessarily introductory, but also open to those as well.
There are two books that I've read recently that I have continually went to. I don't know, when somebody says higher level, I don't know how to qualify that. My expectations of what that is might be different, but I'm going to share these two books. There's one, it's called Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. And then the other book is a book, it's called, I believe it's Subtle Acts of Exclusion, How to Understand, Identify, yada, 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 and Stop Microaggressions, or something to that effect. I wish I had them on hand. I could put them in the chat field, but those are the two books. They're about 150 pages long. They're incredibly informative. They're really easy reads. I think I read both books, matter of fact, in like 3 days, both of them. They were good. They were hard to put down, but these were digestible books. They had clear action items, and these were action-oriented books that actually made you go through exercises, which I found like phenomenal. So those are the two books that I would add. Of course, those aren't the only two books. There were like a bajillion books. Like honestly, I could give you like a laundry list of books, but those are the two that I found most helpful for even myself as a person of color, mind you, who has perpetuated white supremacy culture unintendedly, right? Because of my own blind spots. So these are great books.
Oh, thank you, Jerome. Yes, I love that you said that too, who is as a person of color who has perpetuated white supremacy, because I think that it's important that we're all constantly unpacking the ways that we contribute to white supremacy and dismantle it and trying to disrupt it all together, because we all play our own parts. Sue or Bernette, do you have books or resources that you would recommend?
I think Jerome's recommendations were really good. One that in my community, especially around the courageous conversations, like the volunteers there have been doing, Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy workbook. And to me, it's not just introductory, but if you go back in the workbook again and again, there's always something that you can dig a little deeper and just be like, oh, and kind of just check yourself on that, is the only other book that I would recommend right now.
Can you say it one more time?
I'm sorry, Me and White Supremacy.
Me and White Supremacy. Make sure everyone get that also in the chat. And Sue, do you have any recommendations?
So I think probably the ones that I would recommend are on most of the lists that you can get out there very easily by Googling. So what I would add that might be different is just to supplement that with fiction, with history. I feel like I have to do a lot of educating myself to fill in what I didn't get in school and to kind of reverse what might have been whitewashed in school. And so I think that reading fiction, for example, helps provide insight into different lived experiences than my own, and can be a good supplement to some of the anti-racism books, because there's a lot of great ones out there.
Might I add
Oh, I
just
agree.
one more thing? And this is to, again, sort of foot stomp what Sue just said. I think we all are very quick to try to solve issues that we don't even understand, right? These are issues that are 300 plus years old, and we don't really understand it. We don't even think about our nonprofit's place and how the organization was founded. There are organizations that were founded in the post-Civil War era, right? These are organizations like United Way. These are organizations that we like all know about, by the way. United Way, Salvation Army, there are a lot, right? Sierra Club. These are organizations that are revered. They do respectable work. And these organizations were, again, founded during a really tense time around racism. We don't do enough of learning their historical foundations and roots, and that doesn't diminish the work that they're doing now. But what I'm saying is history, what Sue said, history, read your history and teach yourself the things that we were not told in school, because the 1700s, 1800s, where a lot of these organizations were founded, were rooted in a time of like racial crisis. And we don't do enough to acknowledge that. We seek to like solve issues that we don't understand, and we want to like rush to that, but without understanding history. And so I would say Sue is correct. Understand history, how we got to this point.
Absolutely. That's actually my jam. I love saying that those of us who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. And it's so true. And I also was thinking while you were speaking, Jerome, what was a time in our history where we were not in the midst of a racial crisis, unfortunately, right? And I laugh and I say this in a very light way, and obviously it's not a light topic, but it's just something that is constantly ongoing, and we constantly have to do the work. And a few other folks have recommended other resources in the chat, so I definitely would advise everybody to take a look at the chat. One person suggested the blog nonprofitaf.com as a great resource. And someone just said that they finished Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which I've heard a lot of great things about, that provides a powerful context of history to the present. And someone also said that they wish more conversations like this took place, then the world would be a better place. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, or the version Jason Reynolds wrote for teens. Daily Emails from Anti-Racism Daily. So it looks like we did start our roadmap. We definitely are listing some action items here. I really hate the way that time goes, because I think that there's so much more that we have to learn from all three of you. And I think, I think, just given the way the chat was on fire today, I think that folks have definitely gleaned some very valuable information from all of you. Someone asked to repeat the name of what I'm a part of. I do a program called History on Lowell with the UMass Lowell history professor, Robert Forant, and we talk about primarily immigration history, but a lot of the issues that face immigrant groups as they come in, and how we just tend to repeat that history over and over again. So if folks want to check that out as well. I'm going to call upon Lori. I think that it is time for the roadmap, but before we do that, I would like for our panelists, if you could leave us with just one last gem of your wisdom. What is something that you would like to leave us with, or maybe one action item that you would like to leave us with as we close out for tonight?
I guess the only thing that I would say is you're not going to be an expert after we all log off today. Let's be real. Have a constant thirst for knowledge and continually educate yourself and take little steps, right? We're not talking about perfection here. We're talking about just progress, right? Make progress. That's all I would say about that.
Yeah, add on to that is be kind and have grace for yourself with this work. And if you are supporting other folks when they make their mistakes, call them in, don't call them out, because everyone is in different spaces in this. So that's really where what my two things is really having grace, not only for yourself, but for others.
And I would just add, I'm not usually on panels for things that I don't have expertise in. And I was pretty nervous about this because equity and volunteering is, I feel like I'm still really on the front end of that. So there was a great tweet from Marcella Tillett, who's from the Brooklyn Foundation. She said, we have to learn and do at the same time. And another one of our local activists talks about waiting as a privilege. So how do I educate myself, but still dig for the courage and show up to the conversation and be part of it and learn from it for good and when I mess up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. You have been incredible. I think that you all made excellent points, and it's all ways that I personally strive to live my life. And one thing I would add is just don't be afraid to be wrong, because we are going to be wrong about this. You are going to get it wrong. You cannot be afraid. As Bernette does her courageous conversations, right? So let's get courageous. Don't expect to know everything, as Jerome said. Yes. Thank you, Sue. All of you have been incredible. Yes, this has been recorded. Lori, are we going to do the roadmap and start talking about some action items?
Yeah, we can do that. So I'm going to share my screen. The document, before I do this, a little disclaimer. The document is kind of a mess, just because I was trying to keep up with what was going on, pull questions from the chat, blah, 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 blah. But I think it'd be worthwhile to just scroll back, up through this document I have. We can look at ways that we can take action. And then I think what I'll want to do is work with our panelists a little to make sure, and Maritza, to make sure we've captured everything. Share this document back with you. If there are any unanswered questions, we'll try to tackle them. But I really hope that all of you continue with future conversations about this in the community, that we take this someplace, because all of us are so concerned about it, and there's a ton of knowledge. And yeah, I'm willing to learn as I do. That's what I'm doing right now. So just have to keep doing it, right? So anyway, let me just share my screen and show you where we're starting. It'll be super brief. We have Layla Saad also. Let me just open this up. Okay, so all I did was start jotting things down. And we talked a lot about asset mapping. This is something organizations can do. There's more detail in here than we're going to get into. I'm just going to go over the headlines. Promote volunteering as civic engagement. And there were suggestions in the chat about really indoctrinate is the only word I can think of right now. Forgive me. Like socialize kids in the community from the beginning with this attitude, which can be a very powerful attitude. Treating volunteers as partners versus a transactional exchange. I think that ramifies through everything that we do as organizations, including how we thank and acknowledge donors who are volunteering their money. That's a whole related but other topic, which is connected to fixing the funding mechanism. We talked about paying for volunteers, that being kind of a double-edged sword, but how important that can be. Money is a token of appreciation. And then where do we start? So we went through a lot of different things about starting, and looks like I wrote it twice because I was so motivated by it, but we had a lot of different suggestions along these lines, and talking about how our language and our images matter, and how we need to make sure that our message out there is welcoming to the BIPOC community. Don't just assume that they're going to want to come and get whatever we have. So this is don't treat constituents differently, meaning don't treat your different kinds of constituents differently. Don't treat your volunteers in certain key ways differently from your clients, et cetera. Talk to your clients. We talked about avoiding tokenism, being transparent, and also that quote, transparency is key, and kindness. If you can Google it, say no more. Reaching out to experts. We also talked about partnering with organizations that have already, well, universities or companies even that have done a bunch of research. Jerome, I'd love to know more about that. I don't know anything about that. And then our books, resources. And I thought those last comments were just unbelievable from our three presenters. But I can't remember, Jerome, what yours was. I kind of had the last two in my head, but I can't keep that much more in my mind. Could you just shout out what you said, Jerome?
Of course. I said that we're not going to be experts by the end of today's panel, and then to stay thirsty. I think it's a matter of not seeking perfection, but just making progress.
Right. Hang on, there, make progress. And then Bernette, you talked about being kind.
Having grace.
Say it again.
Yep, being kind to yourself and others and having grace. And then also to calling in and not calling out.
Right. And then Sue, that learn and do. Mm-hmm. Right. Waiting is a privilege. Folks, this has been awesome. I mean, for me, I hope it has been for all of you. Marissa, just want to say a last goodbye?
Absolutely. Yes, that document will be shared out. There's also an evaluation form, and that should be in the chat fairly
I'll put
soon.
that in stat.
Awesome. Thank you so much again to our panelists, Bernette, Jerome, Sue. You all were amazing. Thank you all for all of the attendees for your insightful questions and your comments in the chat. And of course, thank you to Lori for her tireless efforts to make sure that this happened and bring us all to the table to have this conversation. We look forward to seeing you all again and continuing the conversation and continuing this work. And I'm looking forward to making this world maybe a little bit brighter and a little bit better with all of you. Thank you and have a great night.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.